History is full of bad decisions, but some are so disastrous that they change the world forever. Imagine a world where the Byzantine Empire still ruled Anatolia. The Ottoman Empire never existed, and kebabs were called Byzantine meat twists. Strange, right? But not as strange as what actually happened in 1071. The Battle of Manzikert wasn't just another medieval conflict, it was a turning point, an event that shattered the Byzantine Empire, set the stage for the First Crusade, and paved the way for the Ottoman Empire. And it all happened because of one bad decision. In 1071, Romanos IV, Diogenes, the Byzantine emperor, gathered a massive army. His mission was to crush the Seljuk Turks, reclaim Byzantine dominance in Anatolia, and prove he was the greatest emperor of his time. By the end of the day, the Byzantine army was wiped out, Romanos IV was captured, and the empire never fully recovered. The setting. A time of bad decisions and even worse haircuts. The year was 1071, a time when emperors were constantly backstabbing each other. Everyone thought they were a military genius, and people believed drinking mercury could cure diseases. At the center of this chaotic medieval world were two men who couldn't be more different. On one side was Romanos IV Diogenes, the Byzantine emperor. He was confident, ambitious, and had a serious case of overconfidence. On the other side was Alp Arslan, the Sultan of the Seljuk Turks, a brilliant strategist, a master of cavalry warfare, and someone who actually knew how to fight a battle properly. Why this battle mattered. This battle ended Byzantine dominance in Anatolia, set the stage for the Crusades, and directly led to the rise of the Ottoman Empire centuries later. This wasn't just another medieval fight over land, it was the turning point that shaped the next 1,000 years of history. What to expect? A step-by-step breakdown of the battle, the military strategies used, the worst mistakes made by Romanos IV, and a whole lot of historical drama. If you love history that's accurate, engaging, and a little bit ridiculous, then you're in the right place. The Battle of Manzikert is where the Byzantines lost Anatolia, and Romanos IV lost everything. The year was 1071. The Byzantine Empire, once the greatest power in the Mediterranean, was now a struggling empire, plagued by internal conflicts, weak leadership, and a crumbling military. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Turks, a rising force from Central Asia, were expanding into Anatolia. The two empires were on a collision course, and neither could afford to lose. The world in 1071, a chaotic mess. The Byzantine Empire had once been a superpower. Its capital, Constantinople, was the most advanced city in Europe. Its navy ruled the Mediterranean, and its armies were feared across the known world. But by 1071, that glory was fading. Decades of political infighting had weakened the empire from within, and frequent wars had drained its resources. The economy was in decline, and the once mighty Byzantine military was now relying heavily on mercenaries. At the same time, the Seljuk Empire was on the rise. Its armies were fast, disciplined, and highly skilled in cavalry warfare. The Seljuk warriors could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed, making them one of the most formidable fighting forces of the medieval world. Led by Alp Arslan, the Seljuks had already conquered Persia and much of the Middle East. Now, they were pushing into Anatolia, threatening Byzantine control over the region. To the west, Western Europe was still recovering from the fall of Rome. Feudal lords were constantly at war with each other, and kings struggled to maintain control over their territories. In the Middle East, the Fatimid Caliphate was also in conflict with the Seljuks, adding another layer of complexity to an already unstable region. The Byzantines, a once powerful empire, in trouble. For centuries, Byzantium had been the superpower of the Christian world. It had vast wealth, strong cities, and an elite military. But the empire was now in a state of decline. Political instability had left the throne constantly changing hands, and internal conflicts had weakened its ability to respond to external threats. One of the biggest problems was the reliance on mercenaries. In the past, Byzantium had a professional army, but by 1071 much of its military was made up of hired soldiers from different parts of Europe and Central Asia. These mercenaries were loyal only as long as they were paid, and they were often unreliable in battle. Another major issue was the constant power struggles among Byzantine nobles. Rival factions in Constantinople were more interested in controlling the empire for their own gain than in defending its borders. Every emperor had to deal with conspiracies, betrayals, and rebellions, making it difficult to focus on external threats. The empire was also facing increasing pressure from Turkish raids into Anatolia. The eastern frontier was no longer secure, and many Byzantine cities in the region had already fallen to the Turks. The loss of these territories weakened the empire's economy and made it clear that Byzantium needed a strong leader to push back against the Seljuks. Romanos IV Diogenes, the emperor who thought he could fix everything. In 1068, Romanos IV Diogenes became emperor. He was a military man, not a politician, and he believed that the best way to save the empire was through military strength. His goal was to restore the Byzantine army to its former glory and drive the Seljuks out of Anatolia. To achieve this, he planned a massive military campaign. He gathered one of the largest Byzantine armies in years, with up to 70,000 men, including professional soldiers, mercenaries, and local militias. His plan was to march deep into Anatolia, force the Seljuks into a decisive battle, and crush them once and for all. The problem was that Romanos underestimated Alp Arslan. He believed that a large army and a direct attack would be enough to defeat the Seljuks. He did not realize that his army was not as strong as it seemed, and he had no idea that Alp Arslan was preparing a trap that would change history. Alp Arslan, the Sultan who outsmarted Byzantium. Alp Arslan, the second Sultan of the Seljuk Empire, was a brilliant military strategist. He was not interested in fighting fair, he was interested in winning. His army was smaller than the Byzantine force, but it was highly mobile and well-trained in cavalry tactics. He understood that facing the Byzantine army in a traditional battle would be risky. Instead, he planned to use deception and speed to lure the Byzantines into a vulnerable position. He knew that Romanos was eager for a decisive victory, and he planned to use that overconfidence against him. When Romanos IV invaded Seljuk territory, Alp Arslan did not rush to meet him in battle. Instead, he waited and watched, looking for the perfect moment to strike. He allowed the Byzantines to march deeper into Anatolia, stretching their supply lines and tiring their troops. He sent small groups of cavalry to harass the Byzantine army, forcing them to keep moving without rest. As the Byzantines approached Manzikert, Alp Arslan saw his opportunity. He would let the Byzantines believe they were winning, lure them into a trap, and then destroy them in one swift attack. The march to Manzikert, the disaster begins. Romanos IV believed he was in control. His army was massive, and he expected an easy victory. He marched deep into Anatolia, convinced that the Seljuks would be unable to stop him. But he made a critical mistake. He split his forces. Half of his army was sent to capture the fortress of Alat, while the other half, including Romanos himself, continued towards Manzikert. This weakened his overall strength and left him vulnerable to attack. Alp Arslan, was watching. He saw the divided Byzantine army and knew the time had come to spring his trap. The stage was set for one of the most disastrous defeats in Byzantine history. By August 1071, Romanos IV and his army had arrived near Manzikert, unaware that they were walking straight into one of the most infamous military disasters in Byzantine history. The emperor was confident, believing that his massive force would crush the Seljuks in open battle. What he did not realize was that Alp Arslan had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. Instead, the Seljuk Sultan had prepared a masterful trap that would take advantage of the Byzantines' weaknesses. Phase 1. The Byzantine army advances, confidence before disaster. Scene 4. Numerical advantage. Romanos IV had around 40,000 men with him, but his army was already weakened due to his earlier decision to split his forces. Meanwhile, Alp Arslan commanded about 30,000 highly mobile Seljuk horse archers and cavalry, warriors who were masters of the battlefield. Despite the numerical advantage, Romanos was making a critical mistake. He was underestimating his enemy. Determined to force the Seljuks into a decisive battle, he ordered his troops forward toward Manzikert, expecting a straightforward fight. He believed the Seljuk forces would not be able to stand against the heavily armored Byzantine soldiers in open combat. The Seljuks engaged briefly, but instead of standing their ground, they began to retreat. Romanos saw this as a sign of weakness. He assumed the Seljuks were fleeing in fear, so he pushed his troops to chase them down. What Romanos did not realize was that this was exactly what Alp Arslan wanted. Phase 2, the Seljuk feigned retreat, the perfect trap. Alp Arslan had no intention of fighting a traditional head-on battle. Instead, he executed one of the most famous military tactics in history, the feigned retreat. This was a classic steppe warfare strategy used by Turkic and Mongol horsemen. First, the Seljuk cavalry attacked briefly, then pretended to panic and fled. The Byzantines, believing they had the upper hand, chased after them across rough terrain. As the Byzantines became stretched out and disorganized, the Seljuks suddenly turned and attacked from all sides. Romanos IV had taken the bait. Scene 2, leading into an ambush. He had ordered his men to pursue the fleeing Seljuks, unknowingly leading his army into an ambush. By midday, his troops had moved too far forward, separating from the rear guard and becoming disorganized. This was the moment Alp Arslan had been waiting for. He gave the order. The Seljuk forces suddenly stopped retreating. Then they turned around fast. Within moments, the Byzantine army, which had been spread thin while pursuing the Seljuks, found itself completely. The battlefield became a nightmare for the Byzantines. Seljuk archers, firing from horseback, rained arrows from all directions. The heavily armored Byzantine soldiers, slow and exhausted, struggled to fight back. Confusion spread through the ranks as orders from commanders could no longer be relayed properly. Unlike the heavily armored Byzantine forces, the Seljuk warriors were highly mobile, constantly moving and attacking before the Byzantines could regroup. The Byzantine rearguard, cut off from the main force, panicked and started to flee. Some of the mercenaries, seeing the battle turning against them, deserted the army on the spot. The Byzantine formation, once strong and organized, began to collapse. Romanos IV realized that his army was falling apart. He attempted to rally his troops and hold the line, but by then it was too late. By the late afternoon, the Byzantine right flank had collapsed entirely, and the Seljuks fully encircled the Byzantine army. The Byzantine soldiers who remained were either cut down or captured. With his army destroyed, Romanos IV attempted one last stand with his elite Varangian guard. These warriors, mostly Vikings from northern Europe, were some of the best soldiers in the Byzantine army. They fought fiercely, but even they could not turn the tide of battle. By sunset, it was over. Romanos IV, injured and exhausted, was surrounded by Seljuk troops. He had lost the battle, and worse, he was about to face the ultimate humiliation. The battle was over. The Byzantine army was shattered. The emperor was a prisoner. Manzikert would go down in history as one of the worst defeats the Byzantine Empire had ever suffered. Romanos IV. Diogenes had entered the battle expecting to win a decisive victory. Instead, by the end of the day, his army was destroyed, his empire was left vulnerable, and he was now a prisoner of the Seljuks. What followed was one of the most humiliating moments in Byzantine history, and the beginning of a chain reaction that would change the medieval world forever. Captured and exhausted, Romanos IV was brought before Alp Arslan in the Seljuk camp. The Byzantine emperor, once the most powerful man in the eastern Mediterranean, now stood before the Seljuk Sultan as a defeated prisoner. Instead of ordering his immediate execution, Alp Arslan did something unexpected. He decided to humiliate Romanos IV before letting him go. First, he forced the Byzantine emperor to kneel before him. Then, to further display his dominance, Alp Arslan placed his foot on Romanos IV's neck, a gesture meant to show complete and total submission. Alp Arslan then asked, "What would you do if our positions were reversed?" Romanos IV, unwilling to beg for his life, answered honestly, "I would probably kill you." The Seljuk Sultan laughed at the response. Instead of killing his prisoner, he chose to offer him a deal. Alp Arslan agreed to release Romanos IV on one condition. The Byzantine Empire had to pay a massive ransom and agree to peace terms with the Seljuks. Romanos IV accepted the deal, and after a week in captivity, he was allowed to return to Constantinople. But when he arrived home, he found that his empire had betrayed him. While he had been gone, a coup had taken place in Constantinople. His political rivals had declared a new emperor in his absence. Romanos IV returned expecting to reclaim his throne. Instead, he was met with an army sent to capture him. His former allies refused to acknowledge his rule. After a brief struggle, he was defeated and imprisoned by his own people. His punishment was brutal. He was blinded in a horrific, gruesome ceremony, leaving him permanently disabled. He was then exiled to a remote monastery where he died in agony, abandoned by the very empire he had tried to save.